EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. Every year, the judges of the National Awards for Education Reporting pick the year's best story. They choose it from among the first place category winners. This year's recipient of the Hechinger Grand Prize is Ian Shapira, an enterprise reporter at The Washington Post. He won the public service category for his deep investigation into racism at the Virginia Military Institute, the country's oldest state-supported military college. His work resulted in the resignation of the school's leader and a pledge from the state's governor for an investigation and changes. Ian, welcome to EWA Radio.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
You were covering the military for the Washington Post Enterprise team, and then the story made its way onto your desk. What happened?
So at the Washington Post, I write a lot about the military and intelligence communities. Especially, I've been writing a lot about CIA officers who've died in the line of duty. And so I've had a fascination with Arlington National Cemetery. So last summer, in the summer of 2020, when Confederate statues were toppling all across America, I was wondering in the back of my head, would people be storming the gates of Arlington because there's a big Confederate monument there? So I wrote about that monument and about the Confederate soldiers who were buried around this monument and their descendants who are still alive today. And when I wrote that story, all these alumni from a college called the Virginia Military Institute in Lexington, Virginia, emailed me and said, hey, the guy that sculpted the big statue in Arlington, he also made this big statue of Stonewall Jackson that sits in the center of our campus at VMI, and we're trying to get rid of it. We find it offensive. Will you write about our campaign? And that's how I began this project.
So set the scene for us. Tell us a little bit more about VMI. Who are their typical students? Where do they come from?
VMI is a really interesting place. It's one of 6 senior military colleges across the country. They're distinct from federal service academies in the sense that if you go to VMI, you do not have to go into the military. You do not have to commission. So if you go to the Naval Academy or West Point, you got to go into the military. At VMI, that's not the requirement. And so VMI pulls from people who come from all across the country. I think principally they come from Virginia. I think that they get a lot of people from Virginia. I've actually never seen the stats on where they draw from the most, but I suspect it's from Virginia. And it's from people who were considering federal service academies and either turned those academies down or they were not admitted into West Point or the Naval Academy. And so they decided to look at the Citadel or VMI, which accepts a far greater number of people that apply there.
Some of the students that you spoke with chose VMI not because of those deeply steeped traditions and this heritage that they hold on to, but almost in spite of it, and really for other opportunities that they saw there, whether academic or athletic. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so a lot of students who go to VMI are athletes. And VMI is a Division I college. And so they can offer scholarships, athletic scholarships, and they can offer students, particularly basketball players and football players, the chance to play on a pretty big stage, one that is televised on ESPN, for instance. And so a lot of people go to VMI not caring one whit about the military, or caring less about it than, I should say, than the average VMI student would. And so you get a lot of people that are there because it's a well-regarded college and they're offering athletic scholarships. Maybe you've won an ROTC scholarship and you get to go there for free anyway, but you have no intention of maybe commissioning into the military afterwards. It's a mix of people. But I think right now they average maybe half of the students that graduate wind up going into the military.
So you start taking a closer look at VMI and the Stonewall Jackson statue. How quickly did you realize there was something more going on here?
Not immediately, I should say. The story about the Confederate statue in Arlington came out in July, I think around July of last year. And then I finally got around to writing the piece about VMI and maybe in September. And it was simply just about this campaign that alumni had launched about, trying to get rid of Stonewall Jackson. And it didn't really get into, at least that deeply, claims of racism on campus. And it did not go into detail, or a lot of detail at least. It was simply just about this campaign and all that. And the school was refusing to budge, right? They had been asked all summer to get rid of the statue, and years before, they refused to budge. The superintendent of the school called Stonewall Jackson a military genius. and praised his Christianity and said that these were the reasons why we were celebrating him. These reasons, of course, were not good enough, right, to allay the concerns of many of the alumni and current cadets. So at the end of that article in September, I decided to write a bigger story about specific claims of racism on the campus. And that story took 6 to 7 weeks. And it came with this idea that it simply was not good enough to write a story that said Black students and other minorities are upset about racism on campus. We knew we had to write a very detailed account of what specifically they meant by that. And that's what led to this story in October that prompted a wave of change.
Your story details really gripping and in some cases stunning examples. But I think what struck me is that when we often hear stories about things like hazing or students that are subjected to, sort of like arcane rituals that they have to perform, it's often in secret. There's a lot here that was just part of the culture, this institutional systemic racism. Can you give some couple examples of that? I'm thinking about having, for example, to memorize the names of former students who had died fighting for the Confederacy during the Civil War.
Yeah, that's a great question, particularly because this phrase systemic racism can be such a trigger to people on the right, for instance, and to stalwarts of the Confederacy, right? They don't believe in systemic racism. And what I think these articles show was that it was indeed part of the system, part of the fabric of the school. Right. So one requirement for freshmen is that they have to memorize the names of the 10 cadets who in the 1800s fought for the Confederacy and died for the Confederacy. And up until a few years ago, Black students had to salute the Stonewall Jackson statue. Right. And when we think about this act, the act of saluting, it's sort of in a weird way like, is this requirement there because they want students to sort of mimic what it's like to be a soldier under the charge of Stonewall Jackson? It's all kinds of things like this, right? I mean, the school is steeped in this kind of Confederacy lore. Another thing that I didn't really talk too much about in these articles was that there's this long inscription, I think it's 69 words, that all students have to memorize. It's on this wall by their barracks, and the inscription was written by one of the school's founders who was a Confederate, who served in the Confederacy as well, right? So they make this Confederacy very much part of the school culture. But what I learned, though, was that it was beyond the Confederacy, right? It was just not that alone. It was just straight up racism that you see, or cultural insensitivity that you might see every day, basically.
In addition to these examples of what would be called institutional racism, these rituals and these rules that all students had to follow, there were also some specific incidents that students experienced. And one of them happened to a student named Rafael Jenkins. Tell us about him.
To me, the Rafael Jenkins story was the hardest story to do from a journalism standpoint. And it also was so emblematic of so many problems at the school, from not just racism, but also just jurisprudence, fairness to students in general. Rafael Jenkins is a Black Hispanic basketball player who began VMI in the summer of 2018 as a freshman. He was recruited as a Division I recruit out of North Carolina, where he's from. His father had gone to the Citadel, so he knew what he was kind of getting into with both the military culture and potential racism. Yet when he arrived, he really didn't expect to experience what he did experience, which was during Hell Week, which is the first week or so of the rat line, of their first moments of being on school as a rat. He was told to chant out loud the names of the VMI cadets who died for the Confederacy, and he refused. He instead tried to sip from his hydration pack, and a white upperclassman noticed what he was doing and called him out for it and threatened to lynch him. And he was startled by this. I mean, this is a massive threat against him. He felt incredibly scared. He reported it. And, I was just shocked by this. And the school dealt with it in their secretive processes. But let me make sure your audience is aware of what was said to him. He said, "Jenkins, if you don't sound off, I'm going to lynch you and use your dead corpse as a punching bag." Right? So that was the first half of Rafael Jenkins' first year at VMI. And we can talk about that real quickly, what happened there. But basically, he reported it. The white student was brought up in this internal cadet-run only governance system. They have like a court process, basically. And the white student was ultimately suspended for a year. He did not reapply for admission, and he just left, and he went to another college. But for Rafael and his family, this was a really troubling incident. Why wasn't the student, they had all kinds of questions. Why wasn't this student expelled?
What's interesting to me here is when the family, was talking to school officials, and school officials sort of explained some of this away by saying a lot of our students come from families or households where they've only been exposed to this kind of racist culture. We have an opportunity to keep them here, to educate them, and to turn them around. And then it seemed, though, that some of the processes and these traditions at the schools reinforce the exact opposite.
Yeah, there is. I mean, I think that the school likes to sort of say that they've got a handle on the rat line, the hell week, but they can't control everything. And I mean, and which institution could in this kind of situation? And to give the school credit, right? They have students that are there policing hell week and to making sure that, people aren't swearing at each other, that people aren't spitting at each other, that no one's hazing each other. But things happen, right? Their adrenaline gets the better of them, and stuff gets said and fights happen. So they're creating a situation that is quite vulnerable to human fallibility and weaknesses, and it gets a little crazy. So, this kid, the white student, was ultimately suspended, and Rafael always wondered what had happened to him. And I think that white student's suspension would sting a lot later when Rafael himself was brought up on charges of cheating in his second semester of his freshman year. And if you get accused of cheating by the school's honor court and you are convicted and that conviction is upheld by the superintendent, you are instantly expelled. And so this is what happened to Jenkins. He was brought up on cheating charges later at the second half of the year for a test he had taken in December. And he was convicted and expelled. And my article that I wrote looked at his case. We got his case file from the family, and the article raises serious questions about whether Jenkins got due process.
We're talking with Ian Shapira of The Washington Post about his prize-winning reporting on systemic racism at the nation's oldest state-supported military academy, VMI. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And thank you very much to everyone who has taken a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and your feedback are helping us to grow. Ian, VMI responded to your story very quickly, but then so did Virginia Governor Ralph Northam. It happened really fast.
It did. I mean, the second article in October of 2020, 2 days later, the governor responded and announced that he wanted an independent probe into the college that would eventually be run by a law firm. And the law firm is now wrapping up its investigation, and their results should be public by the end of May or early June. So yeah, he responded. Ralph Northam is a VMI graduate. He graduated in 1981 from the school. This is a school that is deeply important to him. His legacy is part of this as well. And people might remember that Governor Northam himself got into trouble early in 2019 when it surfaced that his medical school yearbook featured a photo of two people, one dressed in blackface, the other in a KKK outfit. Governor Northam at first said he was in the picture, then denied it. And so he's not sure who's in the picture. And his VMI yearbook had a nickname for him that is a racial slur that I won't repeat here, but you can Google it. So he made equity and racial intolerance a huge component of his governorship. And to his credit, he really has taken coverage of VMI quite seriously. And he has been an advocate for trying to gather as many facts as possible about the school's culture.
You were focusing on an interesting demographic group in terms of this sort of late adolescent age bracket. They're not high school students where people will say clearly they're underage if they're under 18. They're also not adults who are out in the world. They're in this protected enclave of a college campus. How did that impact how you approach them and how you talk to this group?
I approached them like I would anyone else. I mean, whenever you're talking to people, regardless of age, if they've gone through any kind of traumatic situation, you want to be incredibly fair to them. You want to make sure that whatever they tell you, that you're reporting and conveying accurately and with nuance, and that they're comfortable with, and that they have consented to giving you all that information. So whoever speaks with me, I go over everything they tell me very carefully to make sure we've got everything right, that we framed everything in just a way that is accurate and the way they remembered it. A lot of times they're recalling things that I obviously wasn't there to witness. So you really want to make sure that you're going over with them multiple times their anecdotes and to make sure that we've got it just right. And we, slice away the things that they can't remember that well and really focus in on the things they can remember vividly.
Do you check quotes with your sources?
All the time. For pieces like this that involve deep reporting and personal and sensitive stories, yes. I mean, on an average news story, no. But on anything that involves deep reportage on a sensitive subject, of course. You don't want to misrepresent anyone, particularly if they're revealing things that are sensitive. You've asked them to relive something that is traumatic to them. So I'm actually now working on another piece about what it's like to go to VMI as a woman. And, this is a very sensitive story as well. And so you want to proceed carefully.
I'm curious about where you hit some of your biggest hurdles and whether there might be some lessons for reporters who may encounter something similar. I'm thinking maybe in some open records request or crunching some of the data around things like the honor code violations.
I think the biggest hurdle I had was in the Rafael Jenkins story because when he brought forward the accusation that a white upperclassman had said this awful thing to him, had made a lynching threat against him, that white upperclassman, that launched this very secretive court process within VMI, right? So it's not like I can just go to the courthouse and read the records here, right? These are private student matters. So you're relying on people's memories of what took place inside courtrooms, 2-3 years ago. So one of the challenges in that case was trying to find witnesses who could recall what happened in the courtroom to find out what happened to the white student who was punished. I mean, it wasn't like Rafael remembered exactly what his perpetrator got. If you had a case in a criminal court somewhere, you would know what your perpetrator got in terms of sentencing. Well, Rafael didn't really remember. He wasn't actually there for the sentencing. He wasn't privy to that because it was another person's student records. So you had to really get good sourcing. And I reached out to the white student who by then had moved on to another college, and he actually told me what he got. And that was incredibly helpful. He gave a few short statements of that article, but I'm really grateful to him that he wrote me back to confirm what he got in terms of punishment, because other students had told me opposite things, including people who served on the jury. So it's definitely a good lesson to understand that if you don't have the records, if you don't have the documents and you're only relying on people's memories, you got to be really sure you got the right information. And if you're not sure, and if you're not 100% sure, then say you're not sure. Don't provide an answer that is not grounded in 100% confidence.
One of the things that came out of your stories for me is a question I think reporters should often be asking young people, which is, how are you communicating with each other when you're not face-to-face? Are you messaging, on social media apps or using Instagram? How are you talking to each other? Because that's often where they're the most candid or maybe the most loose with what they're talking about. And for you, you discovered that these cadets were using a social media app. It's spelled Jodel, but it's pronounced Yodel. Tell us how that fits into your reporting.
So early on, I learned that a lot of Black students told me for that big article that prompted the wave of change that there's a social media app and that this is where cadets spew lots of misogyny and racism. And they complained about it. And I finally downloaded the app, and anyone can look at this app and anyone can download it. And you can imagine Twitter without the names attached. That's what Yodel is, basically. Imagine Twitter without the names attached. So anyone can say anything they want, and you often see people's unfiltered id, essentially. And in this case, they're all coming from VMI because you can set it by location. So in Lexington, Virginia, you set it Lexington, Virginia, and virtually everyone on this thread is talking about stuff going on at VMI. So it was this app that Black people and women who go there complained vocally about what's going on here. And the school admonishes its students not to use it or not to say anything harassing on there. And yet the students do anyway. There's very little recourse, and it's hard to catch them in the act. And it's been quite a problematic thing. And anyone in the world can look at this thing. And it's sort of this weird public face of VMI, where on the one hand, their website and other articles about them might call them an honorable school where they adhere to an honor code and they are respectful of one another. But on the other hand, if you download Yodel, you see another view of VMI that is completely at odds with that.
We've talked a little bit about some of the impact from your reporting, but I'm interested also in the fallout. And I understand that the Washington Post ended up hiring security for you. What spurred that?
I don't want to make it too much about me, but I will say that I did receive a death threat, and I received other threats as well. So it was scary. The alumni and the parents, what they say about me in their private Facebook groups is very personal and denigrating to me and my family. And some of the people have prominent jobs in the world, and some of the people liking the posts that insult me or ridicule me are people who have prominent positions at the school. So it's disheartening to see that, but I don't want to make it about me. The value of this reporting is that it's given a platform to people who otherwise never had a chance to have a voice and to say the things they wanted to be said. But thanks for asking. I appreciate that.
The impact of your reporting does continue, including at VMI among the leadership. Tell us about Cedric Wins.
Cedric Wins is a really exciting person. I mean, he is the VMI's first Black leader, first Black superintendent of the school. He's the 15th superintendent of the school. He graduated in 1985. He was a star basketball player for VMI, and he has really made a big impact on the school. He is out there. He goes to games. He set up an Instagram account. He replaced a much older 80-year-old 4-star retired general who had been there for 17 years, who was also well respected. But I think Major General Wins has attracted lots of popularity at the school because he's maybe more visible than his predecessor was. I think other cadets like him because he's also been supportive of some of the changes that have gone on here. I mean, he, shortly after the big story on Rafael Jenkins came out, he announced that he was scrutinizing the honor court system, and he already made one big change to the honor court system, which is that when a student gets expelled from the school by the honor court, they are drummed out, and the school is woken up at 3:00 in the morning, and the drums are sounded off, and they announce the name of the cadet who's been expelled. Well, Major General Wins has eliminated the naming of the cadet, the shaming of the cadet, from that process. And he's looking at other aspects of the honor court system as well. He's been also very supportive of the removal of Stonewall Jackson statue and other Confederate symbols. So I think he's seen as progressive. I think a lot of alumni like him. Some alumni don't and wanted someone who would stand up for VMI's traditions. But he's a very exciting guy, and I've gotten a chance to talk with him, and I really enjoyed that conversation.
You've obviously learned a lot through this process. I'm wondering if you could go back to that first story or maybe a story subsequent to that. Is there anything you would do differently now?
I think I would have maybe acted sooner. These VMI alumni all reached out to me after I wrote a story about the Arlington National Cemetery, and I kind of put them off for a couple of weeks. And I remember one alumni in particular, and he knows who he is. He just kept texting me and calling me, and I'm really grateful that he kept on me because, VMI is not exactly in Washington, D.C.'s coverage area. It's not even a greater Washington area. So that being said, it's a military college, and I was writing about the military and intelligence community, and it's an important school. It's a state-funded school. I mean, they get $20 million a year. So it's an important place, and we should give it the scrutiny that it's been getting.
As we mentioned, you did win the Hechinger Grand Prize this year. EWA's flagship national seminar conference was virtual, of course, owing to the pandemic. So I'm sorry that you weren't able to come to our typical awards banquet and get up at the microphone and get a nice round of applause. But is there anything you'd like to say?
I just want to be able to say thanks to so many of the cadets and professors who have given me so much of their time. And I also want to give a shout out to my editors, my line editor, my assignment editor, Linda Robinson, who's a local enterprise editor. She's just a magician. The way she thinks about articles is brilliant. And I've learned so much from her. And I am so grateful for her and my teammates on my local enterprise team.
Are there more stories coming?
Yes, there is at least one more coming, perhaps two more coming. So we're not done yet. And I think we're just trying to cover all the bases. And I think at some point I'll likely move on from covering VMI. And I should say also that as much scrutiny as the school has gotten from our coverage, I also should say that I met so many wonderful people at VMI, staff and students, and it's a great school despite all the problems that they and other colleges like VMI grapple with. I just think that the school, there's a lot of good people there, and I think that there's a lot of good things coming for it.
Ian Shapira is an enterprise reporter covering the Washington region and beyond for the Washington Post. Ian, thank you for making time for EWA Radio.
Anytime. Thanks for having me.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there is a story or a reporter you want to learn more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take good care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.